me okay? Do I need to get closer? Thank you all for coming. I've been looking forward to doing this for quite a while since we found out about the exhibit, and it's my great pleasure to be here and share the studio with you. I'm going to run through the slides roughly in chronological order I think what I'll do is hold this and then I can sort of move back. That way. There, that's probably better. I'm going to go through the slides in a roughly chronological order as to how things transgressed, and starting with the Teeters, and then talking about what my residency there, and then maybe going into just a little bit more detail about my background as to why I would be interested in this studio. And Mia's already mentioned, some of that already. So, in any case, this is Archie and Pat Teeter at the studio, probably taken sometime in the 1960s or so. And here is Archie with the building mostly complete, but not completely finished. You can see all of the debris that is still already laying around. And this is kind of a special picture. This is, I can't tell you the exact date, but it was in 1953 when Robert Pond, who was the apprentice sent by Frank Lloyd Wright to help supervise the construction of the studio, and Kent Hale, the stonemason, and then this is Archie Teeter. And Kent is laying the first rock at the base of the prow. And I can't remember where or when I found this particular image, but it's a real treasure to have it. And here's a picture of Pat up on the roof, varnishing some of the fascia board, which just gives you an idea of how hands-on they were with the project. Not too many people help build a house in this, in this direct sort of a way. This is a very early picture with the studio not even complete, but it gives you an idea. This is the lower end of the Hagerman Valley. The Snake River is here, and then it runs all the way down and around the corner here. There's an old irrigation canal across here, but what's interesting to see is that there's no vegetation around the studio, which there is now. Here's another view looking northwest, sort of down the line of the studio, and these little trees are all, well, what are they all, about 40 feet high now. They're all totally grown together. I forgot to show or mention it in the picture of Archie sitting there, but here's a little tiny sycamore tree that is now, gosh, it must be about 60 feet high. It's just an absolutely beautiful tree that shelters the whole yard and keeps the sun away from the yard. Here's a picture of Archie at his easel in the interior of the studio, and notable here, this is the dining room table that Frank Lloyd Wright designed, as well as the Frank Lloyd Wright chairs. These are lights that I'm guessing Patricia Teeter designed. They're definitely not Frank Lloyd Wright, but also note these curtains here, which the Teeters had added at some point early on to control the light, as well as for security. Archie and Pat only lived in the studio generally for 2 months in the spring and 2 months in the fall. And they would spend their summers in Jackson, where Archie sold most of his paintings, and then in the winter they traveled around the world, and Archie eventually painted in over 100 different countries. and here's a picture of Archie, probably from the early 60s, I believe. If you notice, well, here the sycamore tree has gotten a bit bigger, but if you notice right here, he planted this juniper right underneath the what we call the low prow of the studio. And the reason he did that was because he banged his head so many times walking around through that corner, and he wanted to prevent that from happening. This is the carport right here, and then this would be the front door. This is the first picture I ever saw of the Teeter studio, and I would have seen this when I was in college in Madison in probably 1974, when a book by William Allen Storer was published called The Architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright, and it was the first complete catalog of all of Wright's work. And it was from that book that I learned, first of all, that this was indeed the only Frank Lloyd Wright building in Idaho. And actually at that point, I never thought too much about this, because I didn't realize I would end up living the rest of my life in Idaho. This is one of the first pictures that I actually took from almost the same view of the studio. And a couple of things you can see here. Number one is the barbed wire fence and chain link fence that went all the way around the studio. If you can go back to that first picture from a distance of seeing the studio with no vegetation around it, and then try to imagine a fence like that all the way around with barbed wire. And the road that the studio was built on was originally the main east-west, Highway 30, the main east-west road in Idaho, and later on, you know, a diversion got, or how do you say, a faster way up the grade got built, and then of course Highway 84 got built. So now it's sort of a tertiary highway. But you would have come around the corner and you would have seen that very unusual looking building with this god-awful fence around it. So one of the very first, actually the very first thing I did was to remove that barbed wire. So these are pictures of the, this is probably my second visit to the studio in 1982, in January of 1982. I had my eye on it for about 6 or 7 years. When I moved to Sun Valley to work a summer job, rather than a normal 21-year-old who would have gone hiking in the Sawtooths or done something like that, I had a friend who knew about the Teeter studio, and so we drove down to Bliss to see it. And I had been looking at it for, that would have been in 1977, and so this is in 1982. I had been looking at it for 6 or 7 years and watching it steadily deteriorate. As I understand, the last time the Teeters were at the studio was in 1976, and Archie died in 1978. So, you know, progressively it got in worse and worse condition. And I had a friend going down to Hagerman from Ketchum, and he was going to visit a friend, and I just off the top of my head said, why don't you just check on the Teeter studio and see what's happening with it? And I forgot that I'd even mentioned it to him, and he called me up the next day with the real estate listing. And it had come on the market, it had come on the market like 5 days before that. And so I was flying out of Boise, so I made a detour down to Hagerman, the Hagerman Valley, and made an appointment with the local realtor to see the studio. I had no intention of buying it. I only wanted to see the inside, and because those awful curtains had been pulled the whole time, and I wondered what it was like inside. And so it wasn't exactly a very honest thing to do, but nevertheless, it sowed a seed in my mind of what a great hands-on project to acquire a Frank Lloyd Wright house, because like Mia had said, it was my passion in life, was his architecture. And what a great opportunity to learn hands-on about Wright. And of course, it's been my whole life ever since then. I certainly never envisioned that I would be there almost 40 years later, but that's the way it's worked out.
Are you going to tell us what you paid for?
Nope. There's that tree that Archie had planted, and that's how big it got. Probably the second thing I did was to get out my saw and cut branch by branch out of that tree and to reveal that beautiful corner. It's one of the most beautiful corners in the whole studio. And this was what the patio leading to the front door looked like as I bought it. There were a number of structural issues that had to be dealt with, and one of the things is this TV antenna post, which was used to support this cantilever. What doesn't show is that cantilever sticks out 15 feet from the front door, and it's essentially the first room of the studio. But you know, that just had to go, and so we worked out a plan to make that happen. Here's looking the other way. Here's the sycamore tree, and you see there's another post right there, which we had to deal with as well. And then this is right down here is called the bunkhouse, and the original Frank Wright apprentice, or second apprentice who was there, Tom Casey, built that as a place to live in while he worked on the studio. And I wanted to save that, but it was in too bad a condition, and so we had to tear it down, but we rebuilt an even more beautiful bunkhouse on the same site. So here's the front door. This is the door to the kitchen, which it's I guess you call that a Dutch door, but it gives you a little bit of an idea of the top part. The Teeters, particularly Pat Teeter, was very afraid of burglary happening and very security-minded. I think that's probably the main reason for those curtains, is to try to protect the place, because literally they were not there most of the year. And then this is what we call the prow of the studio. And here again is another issue that had to be dealt with, was this knee brace. This cantilever from here to here is 35 feet, which is a huge, huge cantilever, and Wright really never provided for an adequate way to support it, and so that was another one of my projects. Here is the beautiful rock work that Kent Hale did on the studio. Kent Hale was a mason from Oakley who found out that Frank Lloyd Wright was going to be building a project in Idaho, and he knew from his training as a landscape architect at Utah State University, he knew all about Frank Lloyd Wright's architecture, and he went out of his way to get the job. And it's a wonderful story, but it's also a tragic story, because Pat Teeter fired Kent after he was about 2/3 of the way finished with his job. Kent and Archie were together working on the studio, and Pat was back in New York trading letters back and forth with Archie all the time. And I think she always thought that maybe Archie was a little bit lazy or something like that, when obviously that's not true, because he painted, 4,000 paintings. He certainly wasn't that way. But it was a rough winter, and they spent a lot of time bringing rock from Oakley to the site, and she ended up firing him. So the rock, basically from the windowsill level up, is done by a different stonemason, and the top of the chimney is done by a different stonemason, and the quality of it is it's much different from what Kent did, and it's too bad that he didn't get to finish it. But this is some of the finest rock work in any Frank Lloyd Wright house, laid in what what Kent called a ledge-type stone, but it's very horizontal. Wright called in his specifications for the mason to imitate the stonework at Falling Water in Pennsylvania, the famous house that sits over the waterfall. So this would have been my first visit too, and this was Neil Wright, who was an architect in Sun Valley, who had been my boss for the last 5 years, and this was Kathy Minard, who was a local realtor, and I always kind of chuckle because she's got her yellow Century 21 jacket on there, but to her, she didn't really know what this house was or what it was, but to her credit, she really tried to learn and understand and appreciate what a special place it was. And Neil had come to help me determine, if it was worth making an offer on or not, if the structural problems would be too much to deal with or whatever. And you can see some of the Teeter's furniture, this large sofa, and there's another sofa over here. There were built-in seats that went along each window, each bay of windows, and then this was a little cabinet for storing paints.
Is it a concrete floor?
It's a concrete floor, yes, which is typical of Frank Lloyd Wright, yes. And there you can see the window seats were movable. A typical Wright house didn't have seats that you could move like this, and so one of the things I did was make them permanent. Here's looking back towards the front door of the studio. Now, something that's quite interesting here is this beam that runs down the center of the studio is a 12-inch by 18-inch solid fir beam that's 46 feet long. And by the time, this is long into the construction and long after Kent Hale had been fired. He was fired in 1953. This was probably taken in, I'm going to guess, 1956 or something, but Mrs. Teeter had alienated all of the local lumber yards, and this beam had arrived in Wendell at the lumber yard, and the man who owned the lumber yard apparently said that he would rather see that beam made into matchsticks than have the Teeters get it, and because they hadn't paid their bills, which was a fairly typical sort of a thing. So I think Pat went to their neighbor in the Hagerman Valley, Vardis Fisher, who some of you may know from around here, who was one of the most famous Idaho authors, who was born on the South Fork of the Snake River, and he lived the last years of his life in Hagerman. And Pat and Vardis went to the lumber yard and brought this beam back to the site here. And then he and Archie, using 2 hay derricks, raised it up into place. And payment for this from Pat for Vardis were 2 bottles of whiskey. So this is a view of the fireplace, and this is indeed Kent Hale's work right here, up until a point about right here where somebody else finished it. But one of the things that most bothered me when I saw the inside was this post, this pink metal post, which was never meant to be there, but Kent had put it there as a construction, as a support for the construction of the breast of the chimney there. And Pat didn't believe that he had supplied the proper reinforcing, and of course, logically, she thought this beam comes and rests right on that corner. But what actually happens that we discovered is that the beam rests on the back of the fireplace. So one of the early projects that we did was to put a 4x4 post from right in front of it down to the ground and leave about a 1/4-inch gap on the top. And then we cut the metal post out with a welding torch. And so if it would have fallen it would have only fallen 1/4 of an inch. Well, it's still standing like that. This was the very, very tiny kitchen, and this was the man who eventually became my contractor, Jack McNamara, and we worked together on the restoration project. But typical of Frank Lloyd Wright, it was a tiny, tiny kitchen. I believe it was 8 feet by 12 feet, and I knew that one of the things I needed to do was to expand that and make a bigger kitchen. So this is the floor plan of the studio as it originally was, and this is the restoration work that I did in 1982. You see the front door is here, the dining table's here, the fireplace is here. Archie's easel was always out here, and this is a tiny little bedroom, which is not even a bedroom, it's just a partitioned off space. But the whole geometry of the studio is based on an equilateral triangle. That's why the shapes are so unusual. I mean, that pillar right there is an equilateral triangle. This was typical of the way Wright worked at this point in his life, using unusual geometries like that. Well, it bothered my eye greatly to see these 2 rectangular rooms imposed on that geometry. So this is what I did, was expanded the kitchen into the back. This workshop or storage room, which was, when I got there, was mostly just full of junk and not really usable. So that was part of the restoration. And this is kind of a horrible shot for me to look at these days, but this is what we did. This is what the studio looked like 6 months after I bought it. We turned into a wood shop, and the lights hanging from the ceiling, and all the tools and equipment in there. And so one of the projects that we did was to replace all of the windows, which are all single pane glass, and there are 105 windows in the studio, and most of them are different shapes or slightly different shapes, and so it was an enormous undertaking. What had happened was that being single pane, the glass had condensed on the inside and dripped, and so all of the wood trim on the inside was water stained, and that was what I really wanted to get rid of, but it made no sense to do it unless you changed to thermopane glass. And so we did that. One of the things about thermopane glass has a little 1/2-inch gasket around the edge, so it meant we had to redesign all of the window stops all the way around, all sides of the window, in and out, to cover up that gasket so you wouldn't see it. This whole project took about 6 months to do, and literally when it was done, it was as though we hadn't really done anything, but except for the fact that the wood looked much more beautiful. And that's actually me up on one of the windows using the grinder thing and what doesn't show, there's visqueen on the outside, and the wind is probably blowing 30 miles an hour, and I have to lean into that visqueen in order to stay up there, and it was quite a difficult thing. I had no aspiration to become a carpenter. I'm not good with my hands, and that wasn't my aspiration, but I did want to be a hands-on participant as far as I could. And so this was indeed something I could do. And then this is the framing for the replacement of the bunkhouse that we did. And here's the Snake River down below, coming from the, let's see, what that would be, the south, I guess. And it's relatively the same even today when you look at it. And there's a rapid right here, which doesn't look very big in that picture, but the waves are actually 6 or 7 feet high, and it is of course called Frank Lloyd Wright Rapid. It's a day stretch of the Middle Snake River that people do. They raft it commercially, and it's one of the highlights of the stretch is to see the Teeter studio. Here's Kent Hale working on the stairway that I designed to go from the main studio, which you can see back here, down to the bunkhouse. And here he is working with the Oakley stone. And again, he was such a master at his work. And we would all the young, it was mostly a young crew of 6 or 7 or 8 people who would drive down, leave their families on Monday morning and catch them and come down and work on the studio and then go back on Friday. And we would all sit around after work, and Kent would tell the most wonderful stories, and he had all of us captivated, and none of us have ever forgotten that man. This is a more recent picture of Kent, and I have to diverge a little bit into a story. When I first, after I first purchased Teeter's Knoll in 1986, I went down to Los Angeles. There was a Frank Lloyd Wright conference, and I spoke. It was what the group that eventually became the Frank Lloyd Wright Building Conservancy, and I spoke about my restoration of the studio. And the first two people that came up to me afterwards were Buck and Harriet Fawcett. And Harriet had grown up in Boise, and she had no idea. They were Frank Lloyd Wright clients in Los Banos, California. And they had no idea that there was a Wright home in Idaho, and they were fascinated. Well, we became friends and would attend these conferences together for the next several years. I had known them for about 7 years when I found out that they had a daughter who grew up with the dream of their house in Los Banos, the construction of their home, and then living in their home. And that daughter was an artist. And well, to make a long story short, we eventually got married, and we lived in the studio for 20 years until she passed away about 5 years ago. And Lynn, her name was Lynn Fawcett Whiting, and Lynn and her dad had found out about this is a red signature tile that Frank Lloyd Wright would put on his buildings. There are many rumors about where these signature tiles are and why they're where they are, but the Fawcett house had one, and the Teeter studio never did. Well, Buck Fawcett, her dad, was friends with Frank Lloyd Wright's a representative in San Francisco, whose mother it was that actually mother-in-law made these, and he got the idea that wouldn't it be wonderful to give, I get choked up about this, wouldn't it be wonderful to give Henry one of these tiles for all the work that he's done at Teeter's Knoll? And so Lynn and Buck, her dad, were talking back and forth, and Aaron there were only 2 of them left, and Aaron got one. Buck said, I have a favor I'd like to ask you. And Aaron says, well, you know, I'd do anything for you, Buck. He says, no, this is a really big favor. And I want to give this to my son-in-law. And so, in any case, it arrived with great excitement. And for me, there is nothing that could be more meaningful than to have this tile there. And so, of course, the only thing to be done was to have Kent install it. And this is long after he had done all his work at the studio. So here he is. It's a little bit hard to see, but the initials FLLW are on that. So these are contemporary shots of what the studio looks like now. And these were done for my book, which was the second book, which was published in 2007. And here is where that awful tree stood. And this is where the carport was. And Lynn and I did a second restoration to enclose the carport while keeping the roof the same. So there are windows here, and there's a small little studio room behind that wall. And that particular wall right there is the last work that Kent ever did. It would have been in 1998, and he would have been in his late 70s, I believe. So he was quite the amazing person, and Kent always loved to bring friends and people over to see it, but it was really something to watch him do that work at that age and how fast he worked. And so this is the studio. These are, Frank Lloyd Wright, they're called origami chairs, and we made those from plans the plans were in the house. They were probably done by some apprentice, and so we were a little bit skeptical about the plans because you can see there are all these odd shapes of plywood. So we made it first out of construction grade plywood, and of course none of the pieces fit. So we had to basically build those from books, from photographs and books, because they're well photographed in books. And these are Lynn's sculptures that she created for the studio. These were some lanterns that she had done before we met. And of course, here's the dining room table over here, and the river below right here. This is an evening shot. This is pretty much the same angle. And then this is looking back towards the fireplace, and you can see that post is long gone, and Wright designed the studio, I believe, to emulate the National Park architecture of the West, and it's one of the most rustic buildings that he ever created. These are all rough sawn 4x12 beams, and this is rough sawn. That's very unusual for Wright to work a rough sawn timber, but the fireplace is 5 feet high by 9 feet wide, and it is really a wonderful. It's a wonderful fireplace. I'm way back, or Scott Zimmerman, who took the photograph, is way back in the corner of the room, and you can feel the heat of it all the way back there.
See how well it draws.
Yes. Well, it draws well. Yes, it does draw pretty well. And I shouldn't reveal the secret, but we had to take this picture twice. And if you notice, there are leaves on the trees. And this picture was actually taken in July because the first one didn't come out quite right, and so we had to do it again. And those are Lynn's pieces in the middle of the studio. And her desk was over on this side, and those were created in the studio. And she wanted to sell them and could never interest a gallery into representing her to market them. And at the end of her life, I basically told her, they're meant to be here. They weren't meant to sell, and they're so perfectly scaled for the site, for the space, that it'd be hard now to imagine the space without them. And there's the dining room chairs and table. And if you notice, the table is actually the same angles as the floor. You see the grid on the concrete floor here, but it how do you say it fits perfectly in the space. If you were to have a rectangular dining room table, it would be such a dissonance with the architecture. One of the things about Teeter's Knoll now is there really are no dissonances, and I think that would be the probably the best way to describe what my intention was with all of the restoration work. This is looking from the entry foyer towards the new kitchen, and we added the skylight up here, which again goes with all the angles of the floor plan. And the bathroom is then behind that gray wall there. And this is sort of the opposite view. You can see the skylight up here, and the bathroom would be behind there. And we basically took, there's a clear story, this is a higher roof here, there's a clear story roof that has windows that face out on the top of this wall, which is hard to see here. But I basically took the same detail and made it into an interior wall so that the bathroom would have as much light in it as possible. And this was a floor lamp that was designed by Wright at some point near the end of his career, which had never been built. And part of my services in working with the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation were that they provided me with the drawings for that, and so we built 3 of those. And this is looking back or down into what had been the carport, and then this is the interior of the carport roof, or of the carport room, this is now a long desk, and my desk is down at the low end of it. The ceiling at the very corner down there is about 5 feet high, so you know, Archie originally had a Carmen Ghia, which would fit in there just fine, but he also had a Volkswagen bus, which there's no way it would fit in, and a pickup truck nowadays would not fit in either. And later, when he became more successful, he had a Porsche 911, and I think that fit quite beautifully in there. And this is what the prow looks like nowadays. Where the knee brace was right here, and we clad it in this wood. Basically, we took the line of the windowsills, which follows the roof, the roof plane, and extended it to create that, so that the knee brace is hidden and that dissonance is no longer there. And you know, Kent's rock work was just as beautiful then as it did in the very beginning. And this is looking outward toward from near the front door. And then this is the bunkhouse deck now, and it actually has the most beautiful view in the whole place. And the Frank Lloyd Wright Rapid is right here, and it's just a lovely place to be. What doesn't come across in the pictures is the sound of the river. The sound permeates the whole site. It's very loud, and it's Archie had spent time in the late 19 teens and early 20s about a mile upriver where he lived in a dugout, and they fished for sturgeon. You've probably seen the sturgeon paintings in there. They fished for sturgeon and hauled them up to the miners in Haley, and that's how they made money, and then culled potatoes from the fields and sort of lived a subsistence kind of living. But he knew with his artistic sense that this particular site was a remarkable site, and of course all the neighboring ranchers thought it was a worthless site because it was high and rocky and dry and sandy, and you couldn't raise cattle on it. But boy, did it ever have a view. And so being a painter, he bought it. Now me, I talked about my background a little bit, and I grew up in the town of Midland, Michigan, which, as I was reflecting on it recently, must have been, in my time, somewhat similar with Idaho Falls. Midland was the headquarters of the Dow Chemical Company, and my great-grandfather Herbert Dow founded Dow in the 1897, and his son Alden, my grandfather Willard Dow, took over the company after Herbert had died in 1930, but Alden was my close friend, and he was the architect, and this is his home and studio. This was his conference room right here, And it's like a little Japanese tea room. Alden had gone to the Taliesin in Spring Green, Wisconsin, and studied for 6 months with Frank Lloyd Wright, and then come back to Midland and began designing and building buildings. Midland was a town in my lifetime youth of about 25,000 people, and there are 130 Alden Dow buildings throughout it, including the home I grew up in and the hospital I was born in, the school I went to, the church we went to, the community center, the art center. It's quite an amazing and unique town. But my mother realized at a fairly young age, certainly before I did, that I was not cut out to be an engineer, that I had more of an artistic sense. And she encouraged my friendship with her uncle, my great uncle. And so one of my earliest memories being about 7 is being in this conference room where your feet are actually below the water level, and then you look right out on the surface of the pond, and it's the most magical place. And she was there consulting with him about doing an addition to the bathroom or something like that, and his back was facing that window right there. I was looking over his shoulder, and all I could think of at age 7 is how could anybody ever refuse an architect in such a beautiful setting? And as I got older in high school and college, I would go visit with him every vacation when I came home. And we got to be quite close friends. And it wasn't a matter of going and spending an hour with him. I'd go over after lunch, and we'd finally have to break off when it was time to go to dinner. And he was in his late 70s at that point. It's just a magical thing that he would spend so much time with someone so young as me. But gradually, as I went to college and learned about Frank Lloyd Wright, we could have a lot more intelligent conversation. And we spent many, many hours talking. And he was actually the first, when I thought about buying Teeter's Knoll, he was actually the first person that I asked. I was on my way to visit with him, and his comment about it was, after I explained what I was thinking of doing and encountering. By the way, I was 26 at the time that I bought the studio, living in Ketchum in Sun Valley, which is, when you're that age, is one of the most ideal places to live, with the hiking and the skiing and etc. And I was contemplating leaving all that behind and going down to do this project. And he said to me, I think you just have to do that. And he says, if I were your father, I would buy that place to make sure that you do it. And then he paused for a second and he said, but then it wouldn't mean as much. And that has meant everything to me. I had to take the risk. And this is me, this is probably 1983 at my parents' house in Sun Valley, and when Alden and his wife Ada came out to visit us. And I believe that's the last time I ever saw him, because he died about a year later. And this was the house that they built in Sun Valley, starting in 1976. If you've been there, it's up above Dollar Cabin. It used to sit pretty much by itself, and now it's kind of been overwhelmed by a couple of enormous houses behind it, and it looks quite subtle now. But it was a 4-year project. It's poured in place concrete, and it was we just totally lived for this project for 4 years. It was one of the great things that I ever did. And then I had a vision that Frank Lloyd Wright's architecture always relates to the landscape, and that his prairie houses, his early prairie houses, are dominantly horizontal, and they emphasize the horizontality of the prairie. And I thought, around Idaho, we have a much more beautiful landscape than the prairie. why not try to build a house that emulates the landscape around it? And so in the late 1980s, I went to architect Bart Prince, who was what we call organic architect, and he designed this building sort of halfway between Haley and Ketchum at the base of Greenhorn Gulch. And basically, my favorite part of the landscape up there are these beautiful foothills, these lovely rounded shapes. They're very unique, at least to Idaho, from what I have seen, and that's what we were trying to emulate. This building is all based on curves, and the idea was that it would be a prototypical building to try to show architects how to work with the landscape. I don't think we succeeded that way. It hasn't been influential, but as a one-of-a-kind piece, it's something I'm very proud of. So nowadays at Teeters Knoll, my great joy really is in sharing it with people and like coming here today to speak with you. But we host numerous events throughout the year. I can't have it, how do you say, open all the time for somebody just walking up to the door, but to have a group come. And this is Kent Hale's extended family who came to visit last summer. I had invited them, and I really, really wanted all of them to see what their relative had done, the beauty. And all of these folks came over from Oakley. And this is Kent's sister right here, I believe is his only living sibling. But all of the others are relatives. And some of these guys can look at any rock in that studio and tell you whose quarry it came from. It's just the most amazing thing. They look kind of similar to me, but it was really something to go around and show them the place. And then I've also had people come last Christmas. Dale Chihuly, the famous glass artist, came to visit, and this is me signing my book to him. And it was just a wonderful visit. He loves Frank Lloyd Wright. He was only there for about an hour, and it was just an intense visit with him. He's just like bursting with excitement to be in Frank Lloyd Wright's space. And I just love this picture. This is Dale looking at Frank Lloyd Wright's original conceptual sketch of the studio. And this is the one drawing that we know was from Frank Lloyd Wright's hand. It's signed on the corner down there, but it's his very original thoughts. And here you have one great artist looking at another great artist's work, and I just find that quite beautiful. Thank you.